Good afternoon, friends, and I will be co-moderating the today's session, the webinar with my other co-organizer, S. Chinu Srinivasan, and I'm sure you are all familiar with him. Done extensive work on access to medicines, and a part of Medico Friends Circle, All India Drug Action Network, and Low Cost Standard Therapeutics. Today's webinar is on regulating COVID-19 vaccine clinical trials, in which we will be discussing issues relating to regulations, approvals, implementation, and monitoring of clinical trials from the legal perspective, a regulator's perspective, and we'll also discuss some of the issues around the COVID-19 vaccine candidates, monitoring, and transparency issues. We are all familiar that the governments across the globe have taken a keen interest in the development of vaccines against COVID 19. The Indian government too has shown keen interest, has taken measures to fund and support some of the trials for COVID 19, including the vaccine trials. The government has recognized the capacity and the potential of the Indian generic manufacturers, being one of the largest producers of vaccine in the world in producing and distributing the vaccines. So the government has entered into agreements and partnerships with the pharmaceutical companies in conducting the trials for the vaccine candidates so that the safety and effective vaccines are made available in the shortest period of time. So the regulations which are governing drugs for production, manufacturing, and distribution, including the conducting clinical trials, were recently amended. I'm sure some of you are familiar with that in March 2019 with the new drugs and clinical trial rules 2019 that actually brought out substantial changes to the earlier regulations. But however, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the urgency to develop treatments and prevention for the disease has been heightened, resulting in the relaxation of some of the rules. The haste at which the clinical trials are being conducted, the clubbing of some of the phases of the trials, the reduction in the number of participants for trials, and the relaxation of rules has raised many concerns on the safety and efficacy of the vaccine candidates. So there are many who feel that even if a vaccine is approved, they will not take it as it is not really know whether the vaccine will be efficacious and whether it will be safe or have any side effects on not so healthy people, and what would be the long-term impact be of taking such vaccines. So the importance of monitoring of the clinical trials and placing the monitoring reports, protocols, informed consent templates, and the minutes of the meetings of the ethics committees, composition of the data safety monitoring board for each trial, the composition of the subject expert committee advising the DCGI on the grant or refusal of the approvals for the drug and vaccine candidates, the documents placed before them to arrive at their recommendations, they have to be placed in the public domain has shown greater significance now than ever before. So an open and transparent system only can rebuild the trust of the people in the process. So in today's webinar, we will be discussing some of the issues and the through the speakers who are all here today, and and we hope we will get to know much more on these issues in depth and their insights. And I would also like to say the Drug Control General of India, Dr. V.G. Sumani, he will be joining us a little late as he had some other meeting right now. He will give us a regulator's perspective and answer some of our concerns on the development of the vaccine candidates. So our first speaker today is Dr. Samiran Panda. He is a tropical medicine specialist and an astute researcher with a standing of 3 decades. Is a head of the Division of Epidemiology and Communicable Diseases in Indian Council of Medical Research, ICMR. He serves also as the director of the National AIDS Research Institute at ICMR Nari, synthesizing evidence to inform policy, actively engaging communities to develop public health intervention, outbreak investigation and application of quantitative and qualitative research methods in the field of infectious diseases, infant deaths, women's health, and stigma have been some of his noteworthy contributions. And Dr. Panda will be speaking on the COVID vaccine trials, their approvals, implementation, and monitoring. Welcome, Dr. Panda. You have 15 minutes, and thank you very much for joining us despite your busy schedule. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. We all appreciate that it's an extraordinary time, and the responses to address the problem that we have in hand, or the problem that we are facing, also requires extraordinary responses. And that holds true not only for research agencies like ICMR, but also for the regulatory agencies or the regulators. So I would speak from the perspective of the area of work I'm involved in, and that's Indian Council of Medical Research. And what do we confront on a day-to-day basis in terms of not only conducting research, but also while we try walk the research findings to the communities and also to the policymakers or the program planners. So that's my first worldview. Let me put it this way. Like, we are in extraordinary time, and the responses in different fronts or quarters would require extraordinary response in order to tackle the problem. Now, if we move slowly then, what is that is extraordinary in terms of the disease or the complications of the disease? What are the challenges that it poses to humankind? First of all, there is now some evidence, because we will have in this whole discourse for 10 or 15 minutes that we would have more questions rather than answers. But let us try see what are the questions that we have at hand and what are the nature of the problem that we understand as of now. The asymptomatic people, which is much larger in proportion compared to the symptomatic individuals, and the ability of transmission of the disease from asymptomatic individuals to the susceptible mass is a challenge. The easy transmissibility of it, and those who get infected, if we think of the long-term complications, so the disability that they are left with, or the life-threatening situation that elderly people face, or those individuals with comorbidity that require consideration, not only from the perspective of treatment, but also in terms of vaccine. So do we have a vaccine at hand? No, we don't. Of course, there was this recent announcement from Pfizer. And that's an mRNA vaccine which requires preservation in sub-zero temperature. And immediately that poses a challenge, because the expanded immunization program that we have in India and the universal immunization program, that generally keeps the vaccines in the cold chain within a temperature range of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. So do we all start thinking of having the vaccine which was announced by Pfizer with its high efficacy? Should we go for it all out, let it take whatever it may? Should that be approach? And probably not, because it's not about a particular vaccine or a particular company, but also the country reality, the situation that we are in, vis-a-vis the challenges posed by the disease to the countrymen. So the discussion, I guess, that the regulations or regulatory framework around COVID-19 vaccine should also consider the country-specific issues and the context into account, and not directed towards, or the discussion or the narratives should not be directed towards a particular vaccine or a company. So coming to the issue of disease then, yes, the natural history of the disease that we know, it does pose a problem. It does leave with, great amount of morbidity even post-COVID, which is known as long COVID, and we are encountering deaths in elderly people. So what are the regulatory considerations that one should have in this context? Now, the usual thing that happens, and which is happening for COVID-19, particularly for the indigenous vaccine, we are all aware, ICMR in collaboration with the Bharat Biotech has helped in developing, and this collaboration has helped in developing Covaxin. And there was this preclinical studies, which are animal studies with small animals and the large animals. And there are ethical issues around that as well, but I will quickly move on to the human clinical trials, different phases, and the ethical issues around them, and the regulatory framework, because regulatory requirements also engage or involve animal studies. The small animal studies and the large animal studies, which is rhesus monkey, clearly showed that it has huge immunogenicity. It's able to mount immune response, and the safety profile, which came from the phase 1 of the clinical trial of Covaxin, also underlined that it's quite a safe vaccine as of now. And we do not have enough information about the immunogenicity. In terms of memory, because there are three things actually. One is tolerability, second is the protective efficacy, and the third is the memory. The memory is a factor of time, and we need to have the time passing by in order to know how long the immune memory persists. So if we park that issue for the time being, we can start focusing on the safety and the efficacy. Now, if the safety, which is from the phase 1 trial, that's also in the public domain, does that help, or should it help the regulation around the vaccine? Now, while thinking about this topic and preparing for this session, I realized that the discussion is just not specific to India, but it's happening globally. And one can clearly see three things on the table. One is we go through the classical pathway of preclinical animal studies, different phases of the clinical trial, and then the approval happens or does not happen. And if approval happens, then it's out in the market, and then we get to see the phase 4 clinical trial. And this classical pathway is time consuming. And can we afford that time now, given the morbidity and the mortality that we are encountering? And in terms of morbidity, it is not just the acute stage of the infection, but post-infection long COVID complications. So that's the question which the regulator or regulators need to take into account. Well, that's the classical pathway. The other pathway is emergency use authorization on the other extreme. Why I'm saying them as, or terming them as extreme, has a reason behind it. And then there is a term called compassionate use. Now, while I was going through different countries, I could come across under this compassionate use, expanded access program that's used by US, United States of America, special access scheme, that's Australia, temporary use authorization, that's Spain, earlier access to medical scheme, that's UK, special access program, that's Canada, compassionate use, Israel, compassionate use, Turkey, clinical access program, that's South Africa, and conditional approval for regenerative medicines, that's Japan. So we are here confronted with a situation which requires doing something in an extraordinary manner, which does not allow us plenty of time, but it also brings us face to face to this question that how do we not do things that would not only compromise with safety, but could also encounter long-term adverse events. The examples, very interestingly, I realized that all the examples that got generated in terms of having expanded access or compassionate use came from the viral diseases. And more so because due to the nature of the diseases, they are not only, they do not cause acute infection, some of them are really able to kill humankind very fast, and some of them leave us with long-term complications, or long COVID, as I said, for example. So this really requires thinking of what do we do quickly, because the classical pathway or development approaches take time. And the compassionate use is about a disease for which we do not have a safe alternative as yet. Phase 3 clinical trial is going on, but the evidence is yet to come out. And can we do something during that time? Because the necessity is much more pressing in nature than waiting for the evidence to be generated. So if the emergency use authorization happens, be it in India or any other country, then it's imperative on us to also let the trial participants to know that there is an emergency use authorization. So naturally, everybody who signs an informed consent has got a right to say that, oh, okay, I do not want to be part of the placebo arm, which is not having the active medicine. And then, in essence, what happens, the trial might not be able to get completed at all, because the number of people who needs to be followed up for a sufficient period of time won't happen. So the evidence generation will take place, emergency use authorization takes place, but then does it generate evidence or information for long-term benefit of the humankind? In between, something happened, particularly with regard to Ebola, and there was a term called MURI. And MURI is all about, it's a monitored emergency use for an unregistered investigational product. And that is in between the classical pathway of the preclinical animal studies and the phase 1, 2, and 3 of the clinical trial. And on the other extreme, as I was saying, of the spectrum, the emergency use authorization, but MURI is somewhere in between. Why do I see this as something which is important, interesting, and for us to take cognizance of, is for the reason that it allows a person to access a drug or a vaccine because there is a great deal of need or necessity, but it also requires that it also recognizes that some of the people, because any clinical trial would have inclusion and exclusion criteria, so some of the people would not be eligible for getting enrolled in the trial, but they might still have the necessity of having some intervention for themselves. So a clinical trial always creates an environment which is away from the real world. So clinical trial does happen in a very controlled fashion. So it's a research environment within which this takes place. But then here is a situation where somebody who might benefit from the availability of a vaccine, but might not be qualifying for getting enrolled in the trial, could take advantage of MURI and can opt for the drug or the vaccine. But if he or she opts for the vaccine, he is not, or she should not be left high and dry. So there is a necessity of collecting information in terms of the adverse events, the support for it, and if the person requires hospitalization, or what is the support system in terms of medical aid, all of these, because they will also contribute to the generation of evidence and knowledge. So I think that there is a middle path as well. So it's not just emergency use authorization which happens, and persons need not to sort of be dependent on the clinical trial. The clinical trial still should go on, but then that does not allow actually generating evidence which could add to the pool. So I think that regulatory or regulations around COVID-19 vaccine requires considering not only the disease course, but also the country reality. But can we have a uniform approach? Yes, I have probably one or more minute. I'm keeping a much. on my watch. So then, can different countries have uniform guideline for compassionate use? Probably not, because the countries do differ in terms of drug access regulations or legal pathways, or even the drug costing structure that is followed by each country, and the company strategy and the cost and the product. And again, if we go to the specifics, the requirements for the cold chain, as we started with like Pfizer's announcement, and will it be very applicable for India? So I leave it there, as I said, that the questions are many rather than the answer that we have for each one of them. I would appreciate addressing some of the questions that might be raised or engaging with in the discussion.
Thank you. And we'll just finish with Anand. A quick introduction about Anand Grover. He will be speaking on the legal perspectives and regulation on the approvals of COVID vaccine clinical trials. He is a senior advocate in the Supreme Court and also with the Lawyers Collective and the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health. He has argued several landmark cases in the field of public interest and human rights law, including the mass eviction case and LGBT rights. He successfully argued the first constitutional challenge to Section 3D of the Patent Act 1970 on behalf of the Cancer Patient Aid Association in Novartis versus Union of India, the patent linkage case of Bayer versus Union of India, and challenged the compulsory license issued for the manufacture of a kidney cancer drug in Bayer versus Natco.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back with the friends. So I'm going to be very fast because regulations are there are plethora of regulations over regulations. So if one starts going through the regulations, you go mad. So I have to acknowledge the assistance of my colleague, Shruti Jain, who's been working with me on this. So basically, the stages which Dr. Samiran talked about, this phase 1 animal toxicity studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. I don't want to go into that. Everybody, I think, knows it. And then the laws that are applicable now, the DC Act, Schedule Y, read with that, basically 122A and Schedule Y. Then new guidelines have come in, ICMS guidelines for biomedical research and human subjects, new drug and clinical trial rules of 2019, national ethical guidelines and ethics committees, and the draft regulatory guidelines. So there's a huge number of regulations. And that's a problem because it's very difficult to see which one to follow, because the act always is the supreme act, and then regulations and rules follows under that. But because of the emergent conditions that have come to pass because of COVID, as Dr. Panda said, we have to see what has to be brought in so as to make sure that first safety and efficacy is ensured, the integrity of the trial is not compromised, but still we can have it quickly. That's the idea. Now, so the traditional law is under the drugs and cosmetic rules 122A to 122DB. I'm not going into it because the remit is very similar, but there are slight changes which are important. So, and then Schedule Y, basically about choosing of participants, permission from the licensing authority, consent, appropriate qualifications, and who cannot give an informed consent, and very importantly, ethics committee. Let me flag that in the beginning. Look at the experience that we have of ethics committees. They are in-house mostly. And are the ethics committees following standards with integrity? That's a very big question. And now is a situation where in the COVID era, every pharmaceutical company is pushing for its drugs or vaccines, because whoever comes first is going to make billions of dollars. So the push for getting things done quickly is huge. So how will it be compromised is a major question, and whether we have the standards which we follow. It's not only having standards, but are we following them? That's the major point on all these cases, according to me. Now, as you know, and Sarojini was with me and she had briefed us that it's not that in India we haven't had major problems. We had a major problem in the case that of vaccines in with Gardasil and Cervarix, where the Supreme Court and the Standing Committee of Parliament pulled up uh, a Gates-funded program, and we are not still seeing the light of day in the final end of that case. We only got an order that the Standing Committee its report can be viewed by the court in deciding whether there is, in fact, a fault and negligence or violation of protocols by the company. So even if we have rules, if they are not followed, what is the consequence? It's a major problem in a country like India, and violations do occur. So what are the new clinical? These are the new regimes that have come in. So quickly, uh, basically, they have broadened the coverage, so it's no longer only the chemicals, etc. So there are number of other things that are actually added on. So they are living modified organisms, monoclonal antibodies, stem cells, etc., genetic therapeutic products, xenografts, etc. So that's the first thing which is very, very important. And there's also a waiver which was there earlier, but this is also modified for local trials. So if you have trials abroad and that they are corresponding to the trials here, then they can be a waiver of phase 4, phase 3 also. And also the time for approving the applications is reduced. That's perfectly valid. I don't think there should be a problem. Why should it take so long? In all cases, there has to be the license authorities approval, and there has to be an ethics committee to monitor the trials. My problem is that actually everything is based on the ethics committee. If ethics committees don't work, and you are more than experts than I am on these issues, I'm not an expert, I'm just a blabber in the court. But I think that's where the major problem is. If the ethics committees, which are actually left to the principal investigator and those groups to set up institutional ethic committees, if they don't work because of various reasons, then you don't have reporting of adverse events, then you do not have even looking at things. And that's what we saw in Kalpana Mehta's case. There was no real compliance of those things. So this is a major problem. That's the first uh, the rule that has come in terms of the drugs and clinical trial rules. Then you have the ICMR National Guidelines for Ethics Committees reviewing biomedical and health research during COVID. So specifically for COVID, and these were actually brought in 2020 April. So if it is research directly related to COVID or non-COVID research or new non-COVID research, then as Dr. Panda was talking about MURI, those have been actually brought in. So MURI, basically emergency use of unregistered and experimental intervention, can be approved, and there are stringent conditions, supposedly. Whenever we in India talk about stringent conditions, I always worry about whether they are actually really followed or not. So then, of course, there are incentives given to the participants that they will get the vaccine free. I don't know whether that's actually ethical at all, but I think it should be there. Anybody participating in the vaccine trials must get the vaccine in any event. But there's an issue about that. The other rule is the guidelines on ethics committee reviewing. This is the same thing. Uh, so, if the participant actually suffers injury, they have to have free healthcare. If there are serious adverse events, financial compensation, and very importantly, and you can see the import of it. It's a good rule. Serious adverse events should be reported to the ethics committee within 24 hours, and a report of the SAA should be available to the EC review within 14 days. Now that should happen, but does it happen? And will it happen is a major question. And I think one of the major problems now is that even the government is promoting the private interests of pharmaceutical companies as well as hospitals. We've seen that across the board in the courts. They are not bothered about the public health issue. They're not bothered about patients' rights. So if that's going to be the case, there'll be very strong pressure to make sure things are approved even if they do not follow strict protocols. And that is my worry. Uh, in terms of consent, there are elements, and there are supposedly mandatory protocols and additional which are optional. So statement mentioning that is the research, purpose of the research and methods, duration, frequency, methods, benefits to the participants community and others, foreseeable risks, discomfort, inconvenience, confidentiality of records, payment, reimbursement, participation, treatment, compensation for injury, etc. Those are the mandatory requirements, and there are additional protocols which you can see in the slide. For want of time, I'm not going into it. Though this seminar is about vaccines, we know right in the beginning these drugs were used. In fact, I fell victim to COVID, and I used Fabiflu, which is Favipravir. I didn't have to go to hospital because I had very good advice. So these were the drugs, remedies were being pushed in the beginning. Favipravir, hydroxychloroquine, not dexamethasone, but lopinavir and ritonavir. All these have been shown to be in the WHO Solidarity trial not to be working, and they've been evaluated on those issues and apparently not working. But they're being pushed. And in India, by the way, hydroxychloroquine was used like every day for months together with the Mumbai police. And large number of Mumbai police fell victim to COVID despite having hydroxychloroquine. Who decided that? I don't know. So experimental therapy is becoming like adventurous to the extreme. And these have not shown to be working at all. Now, as far as the international status of vaccines are concerned, this is the thing, the only one we have which showed some results, positive 90% Johnson and Johnson. There are different types of vaccines. We're not getting into that now. Um, in India, we have about 30 vaccine candidates. Um, Indigenous also, as Dr. Panda mentioned, there's apparently huge amount of government funding. Where is the transparency? What do we know about it? That's a major issue. There's no transparency in any of this. Um, there have been recent developments, draft regulatory guidelines for um, vaccines with special consideration for COVID-19 vaccines. So the endpoints are important, at least 50%, and endpoint estimate is to be over 30%. Now, September 2020, we had Oxford AstraZeneca, and in October we had Johnson and Johnson, and emergency use of authorization for COVID vaccine is also allowed. There are issues of concern, and this is my last slide. Are the trials really promoting drugs and vaccines for the pharma industry as opposed to the right to health of citizens? Is there real independence of ethics committees? Is there participation of community in decision making or monitoring? The number of participants, how many, choice of participants, are older persons there, comorbidities are there, consent, how is it taken, is reporting of adverse events occurring? Remember, when Oxford AstraZeneca stopped the trial for a day, Serum Institute here did not stop it. The Drug Controller General actually made them stop it. So on a voluntary basis, it's not happening. Is there a method of addressing grievances of the participants in terms of injury and death? What is the assessment of data? Is that, like Sarojini mentioned, is that being made available in the public domain? Why can't it be made available? Like, for example, the elections go on, it is all open, 99% at least. Why should it not be available? You can do it without breaching confidentiality, as Veena rightly emphasized. Why can't we have everything available on a real time basis? Why should it be kept secret? Why should it not be transparent and available in the public domain? So, what is the remedy if approval is granted wrongly or not granted wrongly? The only remedy is a writ petition in the High Court, which is very cumbersome because the court cannot go into the fact situation. They will go according to what the experts have looked into. If they have looked into relevant data, then they will say that's okay. If they not looked into relevant data, they'll throw it out. So I'll stop here. I'll stay for another half an hour and then I'll have to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you very much. And I think what we will do is we will take few questions for Dr. Samiran Panda. I will just read out. There were many, Dr. Panda. Maybe I can send it to you. You can respond, but some of them, because of the time constraint, we can pick up only 3 or 4. I'll just start with one question which has been these two, three are for Dr. Panda. One question is that Bharat Biotech head Mr. Ellas said he doesn't believe in restricted emergency use. So should phase 3 be allowed to be completed? Why should it be fast tracked by ICMR?
First of all, I will take the advantage of, for some of the, while trying to answer some of the questions, I will take the advantage of presence of Anand as well, because I do see a complementarity between what I spoke and what he talked about. Anyway, going back to the question that has been posed, I say that ICMR does not fast track a process. What ICMR is doing, because I have the first-hand experience, but I'm here very much in ICMR. So apart from facilitating generation of evidence, we did two more things. While we say generation of evidence, our collaboration for not only development of the vaccine, but also helping out in preclinical animal studies, and also supporting the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 of the clinical trials, which is now ongoing with Covaxin. However, vaccine development and conducting clinical trials cannot happen in isolation from the context of a country and the needs of the people. So parallelly, what we are doing is we did conduct an international symposium where we try to listen to the international voices, and also conducted, and we are that's still ongoing within the country, listening to the community voices. What is the community saying? What are they asking for? So a research or a vaccine development, which is heavily dependent of the public, fund, cannot happen in isolation without having or respecting the needs, expressed needs of the people, or listening to the voices of the people. So it's about creating or helping to create a narrative that would guide the regulatory framework. And then referring to what Anand said, New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules 2019, the draft for amendment was made available to the public, and there the Central Licensing Authority did talk about not only the government doctors being able to ask for a vaccine or a medicine from outside, but also the private sector. But Anand highlighted something which is very, very important. That's why I want to underline that the ethics committee involvement in such uses and in the letter and spirit is so very important, where it is not only making the vaccine available, but also generating evidence and seeing what is happening in the long term is so very important.
Okay, thank you. There is another question to you. Are there any studies conducted by ICMR on whether asymptomatic persons transmit the disease or not? About the vaccine, can it be given to person with comorbidities and elderly?
Okay, that's a very good question, mostly focusing on the biology part of it. So about the asymptomatic people transmitting infection to the susceptible, there is evidence from not only from within India, but also from other countries. Of course, ICMR is not conducting any large cohort study. That is not needed also. Again, drawing upon what Anand said, if some evidence is available from other countries, which would be in all plausible means applicable to India, we do not necessarily spend money to generate the same evidence. And the second component of the question was, one was the symptom and the comorbidities. Yes, that's exactly the point. When we do a trial, there is an inclusion and exclusion criteria, which creates a situation mostly for healthy adults. But there are subgroups, and I'm sure the Covaxin, particularly phase 3 trial, would include people who are not only elderly, but also having comorbidities. So subgroup analysis will generate evidence in terms of the efficacy of the vaccine, in terms of not only preventing getting infection in those who are having comorbidities, but also avoiding complications following an infection.
Yeah, the last question, because we need to go on to the other speakers, and a couple of questions for Anand. Is it about the, most global vaccine companies are making trial data public. So can such a model be followed in India? This is even for Anand also. I'm just asking for both of you.
Okay, so let Anand go first.
Thank
Because
you, Samiran.
yeah.
Yeah, I see no reason why this data should not be made available publicly. The company should be concerned about, and they are very much concerned about the ownership and the intellectual property in the data. I was in a recent discussion on data ownership from Singapore, and they are very concerned about the copyright as well as the ownership or confidentiality or secrecy of data. This data would actually be submitted to the regulator ultimately. They have the ownership. So once they have ownership, I think it is in public interest, even though it is urgent that there should be a vaccine and there is fast tracking not of the trial, not of the trial, but the approval process. See, I think there's no reason why that should not be speeded up, but there cannot be any compromise in terms of how the trial actually goes ahead, in terms of selection of participants, inclusion, exclusion criteria, phase one, phase three, and phase three. You have to have those who are mostly likely to be affected, older people, comorbidities, etc., and those who will actually end up in hospital were there no treatment. So I think those cannot be compromised, but you can fast track everything else. And if you can fast track that, there's no harm in it. I think that's the basic remit. Now, what was the question again, Sarojini? I lost
The
track.
last question is about what is the most important legal strategy needed now to ensure greater accountability? Uh,
Yeah, I'll tell you. I have some views on this. I think civil society is actually not being effectively able to combat the pharmaceutical lobby, which has taken over all the information in terms of what should be done. If you see on television, it's all government or pharmaceutical sector persons who are talking. Civil society's voice is not heard, and the issues which are of public interest are not being heard. And that's a very critical thing. So what we are discussing today should be in the public domain, and you guys should be on television. We are not on television. We are just discussing within our small group, and other people who have actually, for example, the drugs which are now shown in the solidarity trial of WHO not to be working were being pushed actively by doctors who are actually very much connected with the pharmaceutical companies. Uh, in fact, I can tell you remdesivir was pushed by Nanavati Hospital. The doctor said this is the protocol. Why? On what basis? There is no RCT done, but it's being pushed. So I think our voices are not being heard. The fact that data should be made transparently available, that community participation should be the bulwark of any trial, and their say should be very important, is not a voice that is being heard. So I think that is the key thing. Even, for example, the issue of intellectual property. All the COVAX trials are being, coordinated by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it's all rested on intellectual property of the companies. That is not being challenged. But where is the Indian civil society talking about it? We are just getting together now. I think there's more need of getting together and forging policies on this and advocating very strongly on this. Because the moment we start coming out, the media will pick it up, but we have not coordinated our responses. Thank you.
yeah. Yeah, I think it's if you people can answer, I will definitely send you the questions, Dr. Panna. There were many. We have three more speakers, so
No
uh,
issues. Yeah, please feel free to. Yeah,
uh,
please feel free to send me the questions.
yeah.
Just a last comment that for common people, because we have people logging in. So there is a platform called CTRI, Clinical Trial Registry of India, which can be freely accessed. So any trial that has been conducted gets registered, and how many people are getting enrolled, that is there. And we do insist each of the companies who engages with us in a trial to make it public in terms of preprint even. So that's very important. It has to be made public, the information, which is a quintessential component of active community engagement. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for taking out time and then being with us. And I know like we have to rush now. I would like to now invite Malini Aisola, the convener of the All India Drug Action Network, a public health group working on regulatory reforms to improve affordability and access to medicines. And she will be speaking on accountability and transparency in vaccine research.
Thank you, Sarojini. So I've been invited to speak not in the capacity of a vaccine expert, because I'm far from one, but to share certain concerns and questions in relation to COVID-19 vaccine candidates that are in the most advanced stages of clinical trials in India. And I'm going to be speaking also on behalf of a colleague of mine, Siddharth Das, who has with me been trying to make sense of some of the meager publicly available information regarding these vaccine candidates. And in addition to Siddharth, we have also we've also benefited from discussions with our other colleagues, particularly Kajal Bhardwaj and Chinu Srinivasan. I'm just going to start by raising general issues related to transparency. So we know that numerous global and Indian experts of different varieties have been putting forward the case for greater transparency and availability of data of vaccine development in real time during the pandemic. So this is because there are obviously grave implications, and we are also expecting to vaccinate an unprecedented number of people. So vaccines are being developed through fast track pathways. This has already been discussed. And the second thing is that coming to the issue of availability of publicly available information, it is very little and it is scattered across various sources. For example, news reports, replies to the parliament, press releases, media briefings that happen through the ministry, and the minutes of the subject expert committee. This is a concern because the lack of complete and organized information precludes independent scrutiny and feedback. Indeed, there are even concerns here that there is a conscious withholding of information and even misinformation, some examples of which I will give later. And this is, my presentation is really more in the vein of an appeal to the CDSCO, to the National Expert Group on Vaccine Administration, and to the companies involved to share more information. We need this because of various reasons, to build public confidence, also because vaccines are going to be rolled out to millions and they need to be rigorously tested. But also the fact that Indian vaccine production capabilities are going to be tapped into globally, and international trust in the regulatory oversight is certainly required. So, okay. So before going into the issues with specific vaccines, I'm just going to raise a few general concerns related to the regulatory processes and role of government in facilitating development. The first relates to decision-making by the subject expert committee for COVID vaccines, which is opaque. The names of the experts till date who have been involved in these meetings are not being shared. Minutes are cryptic and barely provide any information about the decisions, let alone the basis and the data on the basis of which the decisions have been taken. We are also aware that CDSCO has put out regulatory guidelines, which Anand mentioned, for vaccine development on the 21st of September, which offer some insights into the basis for granting approvals, suggested endpoints, and protocol development, but they do not seem to be getting followed even by the subject expert committee. There are also questions regarding the parameters considered for granting restricted emergency use. We know that there is a lack of clarity about how this restricted emergency use has been granted for drugs, the legal provisions and the restrictions and the specific conditions. And in spite of IDANs asking repeatedly, the CDSCO has refused to share this information with us and put it in the public domain. And now there are some suggestions that this might be used even for vaccines. So to be in a position to even judge if this is advisable for vaccines, we need an immediate clarification from the CDSCO related to this. Then there was a mention of the CTRI database. It remains a source for whatever little information we do know regarding the protocols of some of the vaccines. The problem is it's not being regularly updated. So in the case of, if you look right now in the case of Bharat Biotech's phase 2 vaccine, it has not been updated with the amendment to the protocol, whereas the clinicaltrials.gov, which is the US clinical trials website, has been updated. Several government research institutions are also involved in collaborating and facilitating the vaccine clinical trials. ICMR's institutions are involved in facilitating trials with Bharat Biotech, Zydus, Serum, and also I've worked on preclinical and on the advanced trial. They're working on the advanced trials now. BIRAC under DBT is providing support for clinical trials for Sputnik 5 and providing access to its clinical centers. So there is also an aspect of funding here. For example, the phase 3 protocol of Bharat Biotech indicates that ICMR is going to be providing the monetary support. And we would like, therefore, the terms of engagement, including any financial contributions, to be shared as a matter of public accountability. I'm just going to jump in here and start with the first vaccine I'm going to discuss, which is a vaccine that was developed by Bharat Biotech using the virus isolate that was provided by ICMR NIV. NIV was also involved in characterization and doing the safety and tolerability studies in small animals. Now, the agreement between ICMR and Bharat Biotech must be made public, given the extensive and continuing role of government in development. There are also questions related to any clauses that might, provide intellectual property rights to Bharat Biotech and pricing issues. But I think that will be taken up in a future session, probably by Kajal. There are also we know that ICMR has published on the vaccine portal, and you can also find them in journals. The preclinical and animal challenge studies have been published, but the detailed clinical trial protocols for phase 1-2 clinical trials, and now, of course, phase 3 have not been made available to the public. Now, this is an interesting vaccine because, the phase 1-2 is an adaptive seamless trial. So in this particular trial, the phase 1, there were actually 4 arms, 3 of which were various versions of the candidate. So that was A, B, C. And the only differences were that they varied on 2 dimensions. One was in relation to the antigen concentration, so either 3 or 6 micrograms, and had different adjuvants. And it was being used to look at safety primarily, and as a secondary endpoint, immunogenicity. And we have learned that there was at least one serious adverse event which was reported where the subject was hospitalized with viral pneumonitis and was said to have recovered. But this never came in the public domain. And we don't know how the Data Safety Monitoring Board might have dealt with this. And so there are questions about why hasn't this been shared with the public. In relation to phase 2, there was actually a protocol change. Here, the protocol was amended in a few ways, but I'm just going to talk about the main ways. One is that the dosing regimen, which was being used in phase 1, which was giving the first dose on day 0 and then the second dose on day 14, was modified to make the difference 28 days. Secondly, the number of participants that were initially expected to be enrolled in phase 2, which was supposed to be 750, was reduced to 380. And this was done because they dropped the placebo arm. And now phase 2 was reduced to a comparison between the first vaccine candidate and the second one, so A and B candidates. The reason for amending the protocol has been offered as to expedite the phase 2 trial. That is it. That does not seem to be adequate justification for scientific justification for doing so. And at the bottom of the screen, I just have a little quote. This is actually from the CDSCO's draft guidelines for COVID vaccine development, where it clearly says that protocols that involve adaptive trials should also include pre-specified criteria for adding or removing vaccine candidates or dosing regimens. And protocols for seamless trials should include pre-specified criteria for advancing from one phase of the study to the next. This does not seem to have been followed. Now, of course, phase 3 is about to begin. It might have even started. And in the phase 3 protocol, which was just uploaded to CTRI yesterday, we see that the candidate that has been chosen to be compared with the placebo is the candidate B. And this formulation has been chosen on the basis of phase 1 interim report. It says further that it shows that the immunogenicity of B is higher compared to candidate A, although the difference was not statistically different. So this really raises questions about phase 2 and what happened to the data and how are they being analyzed for phase 2. So I'm just going to talk about the Serum Institute candidate. Actually, here the issue is that Serum is manufacturing a version of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It is as we know, the Oxford vaccine is undergoing phase 3 clinical trials abroad. And so Serum has got permission from CDSU to conduct phase 2-3 so-called bridging studies in India. And these are taking place on Serum Institute's version, which they are manufacturing in India, which they have named Covishield. Now, we don't know what the differences are really between the Oxford vaccine and Covishield. This approval also for bypassing preclinical and phase 1 studies for Covishield seems to have been on the basis of data that was published for the Oxford vaccine. We also don't know what the results have been for Covishield's phase 2 trial, and we don't know if it was supposed to be meant as a non-inferiority study against the Oxford AstraZeneca candidate. The results have not been shared. The total sample size, again, for phase 2, phase 3 is very small. We don't know what the rationale for the sample size or how the data are going to be analyzed. In relation to this vaccine, there is also obviously a tech transfer agreement, but this is not in public domain. This is between AstraZeneca and Serum Institute, and we would urge that they should follow the example of Fiocruz in Brazil and put that out. We also don't have information about what kind of global supply arrangements Serum Institute has. We heard recently in another webinar a few days back, the executive director of Serum shared with us that perhaps they are saving 50% of the vaccine for India and the rest will be given to Gavi, but we don't really have these details. I'm almost done, Sarojini, just 2 more slides. This is related to Zydus' vaccine. This is a vaccine that was developed completely in-house by Zydus Cadila. And here the ICMR has partnered to conduct some of the studies in rhesus macaques. No data or results are available for the animal studies. No detailed clinical trial protocol is available. But of course, there are lots of gaps related to the kind of permissions and approvals that have been granted along the way by the SEC. The serious concern here is about conflicts of interest. 3 out of the 9 clinical sites that are part of the trial are being operated directly by Zydus Cadila. And the last vaccine is Sputnik 5, the so-called Russian vaccine. Dr. Reddy's is in an agreement with them for distribution of the vaccine in India and has also been given permission to do adaptive phase 2, phase 3 trials. The Russian vaccine, as you might all know, was a non-randomized open label phase 1-2 trial, has received heavy criticism from international experts. So we would like to know, did the SEC review these concerns prior to giving permission? Again, the detailed protocols for the Indian trials are not available. There is no real rationale for the sample size. We don't know if this is being considered as a bridging study and what that actually means. So I'll just leave the slide up there. This is a summary of some of the general issues. I've already covered these specifically in the case of these 4 vaccines, but these are generally some of the things. One of them I'll just mention is the membership of the Data Monitoring Safety Board. This is a board that is supposed to have independence and the ability to actually halt or review the safety data and make decisions. We don't actually know in the case of any of the vaccines what the composition of the DM SBs are, and So this is a problem because we'd like to ensure that they are independent of any influence of the sponsor. So in conclusion, I'll just say that we've obviously raised some specific questions, but these questions are equally applicable and relevant to all the other ongoing trials. They need to be answered in public interest. We also need for the regulator to, to have timely consultations with public health experts, independent vaccine experts, ethicists, etc. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Malini. I will move on to Dr. Anant Bhan. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. He's a researcher in global health, bioethics, and health policy based in Bhopal. He is also adjunct visiting professor in Nagoya University, Mangalore. And he was also the president of International Advisory Board of World Congress on Bioethics. He will be speaking on monitoring mechanisms and transparency issues. He will also highlight the international experiences. Anant, I hope you will try and do that too.
Thank you so much, Sarojini. So I think, again, thanks for the opportunity. And, I've been following all of the webinar series so far. And I think the discussions have been very, very insightful and engaging. So I think I'll probably try to add on to what Malini said and maybe add on a little bit more issues around monitoring mechanisms and transparency issues. I do want to acknowledge that, I did get a fair bit of inputs from my colleague, Hari, as I was preparing for this presentation. Now, some of you might have seen this news report from earlier today, where again in Brazil, the trials of a Chinese-made vaccine, CoronaVac, have been halted, presumably based on an adverse event happening. But there's been a lot of pushback, especially from the scientist community, because they say the reason it was halted was actually a political one. The president doesn't get along with the governor of the province in which the production of the vaccine is happening, at the Butantan Institute, which is actually one of the most famous institutes in Brazil globally as a biotech institution. And the fact that the reasons for halting might actually have been more political rather than based on safety concerns. So again, pointing to the fact that some of these issues are global and not necessarily only in India. And we've seen that happen more and more. The second example I'd probably like to start with is the Pfizer one, which we talked about. There's been a lot of excitement in global media, Indian media as well. We all know that the announcement of 90% efficacy is based on very, very preliminary and interim data. The full data set is clearly not yet available. It's not also been peer reviewed, but the company is making a windfall already in the share market. And the bull run that we are seeing has also contributed to that. But if you look at the data, what you're seeing that claim based on is basically perhaps only 2 to 3 months of observation post-vaccination. So once the second dose is given. The second issue, I think, which a lot of Indian public health folks have raised is this vaccine actually something which we should be celebrating about in India in terms of local impact, given the extreme cold chain requirements, probably around minus 70 degrees centigrade, and we don't really have mechanisms for that. Peter, I think, was also there in one of the earlier webinars, and he has also highlighted in his BMJ paper this whole issue of the fact that many of these vaccine trials are not designed actually to detect a reduction in any serious outcomes such as hospital admissions, use of ICUs, or deaths, and is that the correct endpoint to be using? And this is something other folks have also raised, that if you look closely at the protocols, what many of us should be worried about or most interested in preventing from a vaccine, overall infection, hospitalization, and death, are not really endpoints which are being picked up in these clinical studies. But they are designed in such a way that they pass the lowest potential barrier of success. If you look at the Nature 12th November issue, which was just going to come out, this article is already online. The history of regulations for drugs over the last few months also should worry us. The way CDSCO has been giving restricted emergency use permissions for many drugs. It's unclear, as Malini, I think, was also highlighting, what data goes into these decisions, who makes those decisions, why are only very, very succinct minutes the only ones we get to see, no idea on who the membership of that committee is, and on what basis are they making those decisions. And if that is the history we are going to use in terms of decisions on vaccines, then I think we should be very, very worried about how vaccines are going to be regulated in terms of the data which is coming through. So why do we then need transparency in these trials, and what kind of transparency do you need? So I would suggest that, the kind of transparency we want is one about trials, certainly, what is the design that is being used? Is that really the ideal design? What are the protocols? What is the statistical analysis plan? What are your efficacy goals? How are you going to evaluate effectiveness? When are you going to announce the results, and on what basis are you going to make those announcements? If you're going to do interim analysis, based on which a lot of pronouncements have already been made for some candidates, what criteria is being used for that interim analysis? Is that written up in the protocol already as a pre-decided interim endpoint? If there are early stopping rules based on either the vaccine working very well, or if there is harm happening in one of the arms, have they also been pre-decided? In terms of how the conduct of the trial is happening, where is it happening, and also obviously results, data, and outcomes around safety, efficacy, participant level data, etc. But you would also want to know what the regulatory structures are for monitoring and oversight. So, what is the membership of regulatory boards, authorities, expert committees? Malini, I think, already highlighted concerns in the Indian scene around the fact that many of these are not known, and that should worry us all as well. The other thing is obviously what is the criteria for emergency use authorization, and what is its basis in law? I've been speaking to some lawyers, and their perception is that there is nothing in the new drugs and clinical trial rules which allows for an emergency use authorization. It is not something which has ever been invoked in India. So it's only being probably done for the first time in COVID-19. But on what basis and when which section of the law is a bit unclear. And that also is something we should ask for. So who should be transparent then? Obviously, you'd want the vaccine developers. So, the multinationals, especially, which are involved, the source pharma companies. You would also want the vaccine manufacturers, those who are partnering with the vaccine developers. So Serum Institute is an example. Many of these are in India, which are partnering with these foreign companies. We would expect transparency of regulatory authorities, whether that be CDESCO, whether that be ICMR, whether that be the ministry. But we would also want transparency from our participating research institutions where actually these trials are happening, and the ethics committees. Why should they not be actually stepping forward if they feel that this is an important public good in terms of information which should be provided? And who should want this transparency? All of us should want this transparency, not just academic scientists, but also independent committees of experts should be there, hopefully. If there aren't mechanisms, maybe we should be creating this, which look at the evidence which is coming through, criticize it, peer review information as it comes through, because as we all know, conflicts of interest is something that we are worried about. In fact, on Twitter, there are many people who are actually looking at this information as it gets shared live and presenting their critiques, and that is sometimes very useful, because in the absence of actual formal full information being available, sometimes it's piecemeal approach. You pick up information in bits and pieces and try to make sense of it. So physicians, public health professionals, community-based organizations, as well as the recipients, the public, those who will take the vaccine. So, and then what kind of transparency? One, certainly in terms of when the trial is registered, we certainly need more details on CTRI. The kind of information which is there on CTRI is useful, but it leaves a lot to be desired. There are sometimes edits which happens, but not a clear history of edits. There's not enough information when there is changes made, the rationale for those changes. And I think that is the kind of information which should be publicly available. The trial protocol should be available as early as possible. The fact that there is a pandemic going on is not an excuse for not sharing that. Data sharing mechanisms, sharing of the participant information sheet and informed consent form. There should be more and more voluntary sharing of data, as well as public reporting of the results. Publishing should be encouraged in a rapid manner, but also through peer review, and not just pre-review based claims when you have preprints being put out. There are now transparency standards which have been written up, which are well established, and it would be good to see how these current vaccine trials and the way they are reported measure against those standards. Why is there a demand for transparency? One, because we know there has been a politicization of the regulatory process globally as well as in India. We know that political pressures might bias outcomes. We know that there is a possibility emergency use authorization could be given under pressures. And if that happens, then vaccine trials might be stopped early, even though they might not have actually met the efficacy endpoints which really matter, or the safety endpoints which really matter. We would also worry because it could actually lead to a lack of trust or an erosion of trust. There is already a growing vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaccine sentiment. There are two kinds of elements in this. One, obviously, people who are opposed to any kind of vaccine, and others who might be worried specifically around COVID-19 vaccines for various reasons. and also because of concerns around design flaws, concerns around restrictive enrollment criteria, and is that actually inclusive enough in terms of those who are most at risk. There might be economic pressure because there is substantial public investment. There is already a lot of purchasing which is happening from rich countries for vaccines, and that also is in the fray as a factor. And also ensuring that the more data that we have, the better meta-analysis and reproducibility that we can actually do. We also know that in India, there is a lot of mistrust, some of which has been reporting through these studies. Now, there are concerns around how these studies were done and how representative they might be, but they do tell us that there are already a lot of people who are uncomfortable with the idea of the way these vaccine trials are happening, the speed of these vaccines, and the way they are being developed, and some of them are very reluctant in wanting to take up these vaccines if they are even made available, and that might actually be impacting uptake. So why transparency? One, certainly because we want all our research which is happening, a lot of which is with public money, to be accountable. We need to enhance trust in the scientific enterprise, and that trust needs to stay beyond COVID-19, and we should want that to stay strong. And to ensure that, obviously, we need to ensure that people trust how science is conducted in this country and how it is being regulated or monitored. We also want that there should be independent scrutiny in the best interest of science and also in the best tradition of science, where researchers independent of the trial can assess the data and verify any reported results and claims. And also, if you have more and more of this data available, you could use it to better modify future vaccine candidates. We already know that many scientists who work on vaccines are suggesting that the second and third generation vaccines might actually be more efficacious, potentially more safer, because they would build on the information which is garnered from the first generation vaccine trials. But if this information is not publicly shared, that might be difficult. We also know that if there are decisions which are made on data which is preliminary, which is not based on adequate sound base, then you could end up with weakly effective vaccines being rolled out, which could cause a huge problem, because it could actually lead to vaccinated individuals believing that they are immune, hence reducing implementation or compliance of other measures such as mask use, etc. And that is something which the WHO Solidarity Vaccines Trial Expert Group themselves have expressed as a concern. So why then are companies not transparent? I think probably the only real reason is that they might worry about competitors taking advantage. There might be IP issues. They want to probably ensure that their profit interest is protected, but they might use the use of other reasons, saying that participants' privacy needs to be protected. Hence, we are not going to allow participants to share their perspectives or experiences of being consented. In the previous webinar, there were two participants who talked about the fact that some of what they were allowed to say and some of what they were not allowed to say. And it was a bit strange, because one would wonder, why is it that you would actively stop participants from sharing? They might also say that prematurely releasing some information could bias investigators while a trial is ongoing, leading to expectations about the vaccine, or politicians stepping in and stopping trials and rolling out vaccines because they want to see it as a political step and be seen as doing something. But what could go wrong? Yes, Sarojini. I think I'll wrap up another 2 minutes. If that's
Thanks.
Yeah, we also know that there is a growing vaccine hesitancy, as I already talked about, and this could actually be accentuated if we don't have transparency in vaccines. And we also know from history that once public trust in vaccines is compromised, it is difficult to win back. And that is also something, as I said, from a longer term perspective, we need to think about. And if vaccines are given emergency use authorization without waiting for full study data to be available, it could again lead to complacency and could delay better vaccines, because then you might actually reach a situation where you might have to run the new second generation vaccine trials, not against placebo, but against this emergency use authorized vaccine, which actually, again, we don't have full data sets for, and those kind of comparator studies can be longer, costlier, etc. to run. There have been some examples of lack of transparency already. AstraZeneca did not release its details about the serious study safety concerns early enough. Pfizer failed to swiftly share its amended trial protocol. Malini gave you a few examples about concerns in India with some of the vaccine studies. And only a couple of companies actually have been very proactive around talking about them being willing to share information. And this is something I think we need to look at closely. Again, this is something, as I said earlier as well, which has been seen across the world in LMICs as well as high-income countries, including from the US, where there have been pressures from the White House on agencies such as the US FDA and CDC, and that also risks compromising trust in vaccines. And we all know that while we are all optimistic and hopeful that there'll be a good vaccine soon, anything which is not done transparently and where we don't have confidence in safety and efficacy data might actually result in a vaccine which causes harm because we don't really capture the key elements well. We also know in India there's been a concern, especially including in the Bihar election, around vaccines sometimes becoming an election plank issue. So vaccine populism, vaccine nationalism, and now vaccine sub-nationalism at the state level is something we need to look at. There are many people who have talked about why this is important and that why there is an urgency around it, and that there needs to be independent regulatory bodies which look at this kind of data. But unless that data is available, it's going to be difficult. And we all also need to remember that first generation vaccines are only going to be one of the tools in the public health armament in terms of our response, and will not be the ultimate solution that many people expect. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that will spark some discussion as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Anand. Thank you so much. And then we managed to finish it in 15 minutes. And I think there are many questions to both of you. In fact, in the Q&A, if we can answer to them. I just messaged and called Dr. V.G. Samani. He said he will be here by 5. Maybe, we can take few questions before he comes. Is it okay? Or...
I'm just looking at the chat box, Sarojini.
Okay.
There's one question which I think is troubling everybody, and even Anand Bans mentioned this. The only emergency authorization, as it were, is in the guidelines of the ICMR Ethical Committee Guidance COVID, which are April of 19th April of 2020, April 20. And these are guidelines. So they mention the Muri protocol, and 212.6 is the relevant clause. In case of an outbreak of infectious diseases, monitored emergency use of unregistered and experimental intervention, what's known as Muri. Monitored emergency use of unregistered and experimental interventions may be approved with the following precautions. And then the precautions are given: thorough scientific review followed by ethics review, locally or by a national level ethical committee, tackling public concerns and ensure oversight by local EC, use GMP products, make rescue medicines, supportive treatment accessible, meticulous documentation of therapeutic processes, including adverse events, fast-track research and possible sharing of data on safety and efficacy for further research, etc. Consent process is very important, must be carried out with care. Community engagement and ensuring a fair distribution of scarce supply. That's one question. And then Geeta Sen asked a question, what are the legal strategies? I think what Malini has pointed out specifically, where things are not being transparent, and Anand has supported him, I think there could be a legal strategy. I mean, we can discuss this in detail. It may not be easy to do it now because of time, but I think we should, as a whole, think of a legal strategy to try to get information and make sure it doesn't become just a handle for pharmaceutical companies to make a quick buck and then disappear. That's what's happening. It's likely to happen, especially with the drugs. It's quite clear, So I think there is a way of trying to litigate after we have intervened in the process through asking questions to the ICMR, or like Malini mentioned, that these are the things, and we should put these interventions with the ICMR and say these are the problems, and please let us know on what grounds are you approving and giving the authorization or not giving it, whichever the case may be. And then we can litigate. We must approach the ICMR or the regulatory body before we approach the court. And it's possible to do it. But we can discuss this in more detail.
May I?
Yeah.
Yes. Anand, this Mayuri comes actually from the WHO, World Health Organization, which formulated these guidelines in 2014. in Ebola epidemic.
Yes.
And all the points which I mentioned were also there in 2017 ICMR ethics guideline. Now the point is, I think if they are giving emergency authorization, then the drug is less than approved, right? Or is it fully approved? Because if it is fully approved, then the next drug cannot be, you cannot do the clinical trial with the placebo control. You have to do a control has to be the standard of care, which is the approved drug. So
Yes.
you have to also tell us whether emergency access is a full approval, or it's a half approval, or it is 25% approval. Otherwise, how do you make out? Or, what is the basis of it? Like say America has now given remdesivir full approval. Does that mean that every antiviral clinical trial that is done will have to have remdesivir as a control arm and not the placebo? I think these are the important issue, because that gives a massive advantage to the country which gets the approval of the drug.
No, the company, actually, not only the country, but also the pharmaceutical company.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I think you cannot call it full approval, and I won't like to put a figure on it because that's not the remit of a legal thing. But I don't think you can avoid a full RCT to get a full approval. This is emergency use authorization in an emergency, and you try it out. You have to carry out the studies. Now, whether placebo should be carried out and whether the remdesivir will become the control arm, I can't answer that. That is the remit of you people, the bioethicists and the people who do the study. But according to me, the way the law is framed, the full approval is only based on the actual full trial RCT. But I don't know whether placebo can be obviated. I won't be able to answer that, to be very honest. But I think we should investigate it a bit more rather than leaving it like this. I think it need to be investigated, and specific things that Malini has pointed out are a good ground for further research, and then maybe intervening in the process with the regulatory agencies, writing to them that these are the problems. For example, Bharat Biotech or whatever the company is, we don't want to favor anybody over anybody else. Therefore, these are the problems, and please address these things before you do anything in terms of either emergency or either MURI or full approval, whatever the case may be. And if they don't address those issues, then it's a good case for intervention in court. If they address them on the basis of expert advice, then we fall through the cracks. Then the court won't intervene. That's the problem. It's like, if issues, if for example, in the cases where matters have gone to court, if you have given studies to the regulatory authority and say, please look at them, and they don't look at them, then there's a way of intervening in court. Because the basic line of thinking is, have they addressed the relevant considerations? If they have not addressed relevant considerations, then there's an opening in court. And I think that's the method we should follow, which is safe and tested. So Malini's and Siddharth's interventions were very specific. Anand has also made those points with some other data. I think we can pursue this further.
Yeah. Are there any other questions to Malini specific to her presentation?
Can I play the devil's advocate, Malini? So I, of course, totally agree that there should be transparency, etc. But a lot of the companies and researchers, they say, "Oh, we are going to publish the data. Let the trial at least get completed." So this expectation that, oh, there is a serious adverse event, you should immediately inform the public about it, or you should immediately, bring it out in the public domain, may or may not actually work out practically. So what do you or Anant or anyone think about? I'm just playing the devil's advocate here, because practically it may not be possible to immediately, like, okay, something has happened there, immediately release it here. Once the process is over, they do say that they will reveal it, but we don't know.
Just a supplement to what she is saying, that is it sufficient to publish a paper in a journal or in preprint journal for providing sharing data, or you require the raw data which are anonymized, which can be reanalyzed by other people, because what comes in the journal cannot be reanalyzed because you don't have the raw data with you. So what do you think? What kind of sharing that you are talking about? Are you just talking about not coming out with paper, or are you talking about raw data?
Should I answer? I can answer about the one adverse event. This was in the Bharat Biotech vaccine trial. Now, the concern here was the fact that this event never came to light in the public domain at all. So, in fact, this is something that I don't think has been reported on, because, and we're not sure that the government even intended for this information to ever be made known. So while I agree with Veena that there might be a process through which these kinds of events would eventually be shared with the public, we would also like to, I mean, the other question also was, how did they actually deal with the event? So if the data was unblinded and the Data Safety Monitoring Board did take a look at this particular event, would then the public be entitled to have access to that information about the participant because the data has been unblinded? These are all questions that come up. I don't really have the answers. And I think in relation to your question about the raw data being shared, I think I agree with you that it's not going to be enough. Where certainly want the data to be available for others to also be able to analyze and scrutinize, and for it to be up to public scrutiny. Also, for the reason that the SEC at the moment does not have a very good track record in terms of dealing with approvals and taking other decisions in respect of COVID-related drugs and other products. So there is certainly a lack of trust. But I think Anand Ban can add to this. He would have more to say.
Sure. Yeah, just quickly, maybe, there's also something unique about vaccine trials, because these vaccines are typically being given to healthy adults mostly. And if you look at the serious adverse events, I'm on an ethics committee, which is part of an institution which is doing one of the solidarity drug trials. And there's actually been a bunch of serious adverse events there already, multiple deaths actually. And they've all gone through the due process of being looked at for causality, etc. But I don't think those deaths have received the same kind of attention, for example, which any adverse event in the vaccine space is happening. And perhaps it's because many of those who are in those drug trials are already quite seriously ill. And so probably there is an expectation that there will be adverse events. In the vaccine space, yes, I think, it's probably at least in the larger trials, we've seen some of these events become quite commonly known. How much of that is something we should celebrate versus look at potential mechanisms? I would rather have strong independent monitoring mechanisms than require everything to be in the public domain immediately, in the sense that there is a serious adverse event and it needs to be reported. It's more important from my perspective that there is reliable oversight and monitoring mechanisms which can look at that event closely, because it's one thing to report and one thing to actually look at it and examine it with due process. And I think that is what we are more worried about. Yes, obviously at some point of time, all of that information should be publicly available, but I would rather want that mechanisms right from the ethics committee to the regulator at all levels are actually looking at every event very in quite a bit of detail to try to find out what is happening and is there something to worry about the vaccine candidate. In terms of raw data, I agree that it should be available probably after the trial results have been have been provided to the regulator and that data, the primary paper has been published. But beyond that, I don't think it should stop. That data should be publicly available.
Thanks,
as well.
Anand. We have Dr. Pradhan with us from the CDSCO. We are all familiar with Dr. Pradhan and his work in the context of regulation of the clinical trials. And we are very happy, Mr. Pradhan, you are here. Can you please speak about the approvals and monitoring mechanism?
So, good evening to everybody. And first of all, I would like to congratulate organizer for organizing this meeting, specifically in light of COVID pandemic. We all are trying to address many challenging issues. So with this, I would like to say a few things about regulatory issue. Many of the things are known to all of us because that rules and regulatory provisions are are there, and many of us are fully aware about this. Nonetheless, but I would just quickly tell you some of the points on this issue, specifically related to vaccine clinical trial and their monitoring and all these things. First of all, the regulation, obviously, as we all know, the rules and regulatory provisions are same for drugs and vaccines, so far as India is concerned, because same rule that new drugs and clinical trial rules, which is which was published in 19th March 2019, that new rule that is applicable for monitoring or reviewing and approval of clinical trial, as well as approval of new drug of any new drug, including vaccines, because in our definition, new drugs include vaccine and all other biological products also. And therefore the all sort of regulatory liabilities and requirements and monitoring by all the stakeholders, be it ethics committee and investigators and sponsors, everything actually remains the same so far as clinical trial procedures are concerned and monitoring is concerned. And issue of handling the serious adverse events in case of vaccines, also that regulatory procedures and provisions regarding payment of compensation, and also the providing medical management, etc., all those remains the same if it is drug or whether it is drug or vaccine. And so far as approval of vaccine, general provisions in the new drug clinical trial rules, that is there, where there are certain special situation which has been prescribed, under which there may be some sort of abbreviation of data or relaxation of data or omission of data, considering the unmet medical need, or for a drug which is indicated for a disease which has special relevance to Indian health scenario, or in case of disaster or some public health issues. So those are there in new drugs clinical trial rules. So far as vaccine is concerned, we have not specifically mentioned any specific issue in the rule itself for vaccine. However, a draft guidelines specifically for development of vaccines that has been published, that on 21st September, that I think everybody is aware, which actually gives a detailed procedures and guidelines, regulatory guidelines basically, for development of vaccines, starting from chemistry, manufacturing control data, then preclinical animal data, and then clinical data of in general of any vaccines, including there are some guidelines that has been given which are specifically considered as special consideration for COVID vaccines. That is already there, draft guidelines, and we have received a lot of comments also on the draft guidelines. But and requirements of animal data and other toxicity data and all this, right now it is more or less at par with the international requirement, because in the new drugs and clinical trial rules, which was published in 19th March 2019, there one note was given in the toxicity chapter, that toxicity study can be actually planned and designed and conducted as per ICH guidelines, International Council of Harmonization guidelines, considering the 3R principle. That means, the animal should be used justifiably. At the same times, there should not be any compromise on the generation of data to ensure the safety of any new drugs and vaccine. So that toxicity requirements right now is more or less at par with the international guidelines. And so far as some special situation like say accelerated approval process or expedited approval process, those are also specified in the second schedule of the new drugs clinical trial rules, depending on severity, rarity, or prevalence of the disease, or availability or lack of alternative treatments. If there is a prima facie case of product being meaningful therapeutic benefit, then a product can be considered for approval under accelerated approval process. Also, there is a provision under accelerated approval process which was not there earlier, which has been incorporated in the new drugs clinical trial rules, that the surrogate endpoints may be considered sometimes rather than the standard outcome measures such as survival or disease progression. Because sometimes, if you want to assess the efficacy of the drug for which there is an unmet need, if you want to assess the survival or disease progression or some other functional issue, it may take long time. So in the interest of the public, in the interest of the patients, there are provisions that in such cases, based on surrogate endpoints, that efficacy can be predicted, which are actually that surrogate endpoint has to be such which will reasonably likely to predict the clinical benefit. That is also a provision that is there under accelerated approval process. And also provision is there that if there is remarkable efficacy of a particular drug, which is actually indicated for specific disease for which there is no therapy or it is unmet, there is an unmet medical need, then approval may also be considered based on phase 2 clinical data before even completion of phase 3 clinical trials. However, in such cases, there is a requirement of phase 4 clinical trial also with the approval at post-market scenario. Those things are also there. And but right now, because of that COVID situation, we all know there are a lot of challenges in conducting the study as well as monitoring and review of the protocols by the ethics committee, by all stakeholders who are involved. And sometimes, because during the COVID time and lockdown period, there are a lot of issues that how we will actually comply with the all kind of requirements that is specifically mentioned for under GCP or regulatory requirements. So we had published a sort of guidelines that under such situation, that ethics committee, investigator, and the sponsor, everybody has to be should communicate effectively, and whatever is the best in the interest of patient, that has to be done during that COVID situation because of challenges in complying with the all kind of requirements and all these things. And so far as these are the general regulatory requirements as I have mentioned, but so far as vaccine trial is concerned, I think we all are aware a vaccine is a complex product and heterogeneous product. It actually its mechanism of action and manufacturing and characterization are much more complex than a simple chemical drugs, and therefore it has to be a lot of focus on manufacturing and quality control, data characterization, and ensuring batch to batch consistency. All those things are specific for vaccine products. And similarly for clinical development also, unlike drugs, there are a lot of differences while we conduct a clinical trial in vaccine. As I think Dr. Jashani was mentioning that yes, in vaccine, phase 1 trial, not only phase 1 trial, but also phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials are also conducted on healthy volunteers, unlike drugs, because in case of drugs, generally phase 1 trial is conducted in healthy volunteers unless there is any safety issue. Then thereafter phase 2, phase 3 is conducted actually on the patients. But in this case, unless otherwise the vaccine is a therapeutic one, the trial phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 are conducted in healthy volunteers. So, and in phase 1 clinical trial, obviously the primary endpoints is the safety. But at the same time, along with the safety assessment, that immunogenicity, preliminary immunogenicity assessment is also carried out in phase 1 clinical trial. And while in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trial with a vaccine, that includes assessment of immunogenicity, efficacy, as well as safety. And in case of phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trial, generally primary endpoints are the efficacy and secondary endpoint is safety. While in phase 1, the primary endpoint is safety, and secondary endpoint is actually assessment of immunogenicity. And in many cases in vaccine, unlike drugs, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trial are conducted in some sort of in under one protocol. Sometimes it is termed as phase 2/3 clinical trials. So initially there will be a first part where some sort of proof of concept study, that is phase 2, will be done, and based on that that can be continued with the phase 3 clinical trial to assess immunogenicity and safety. And that is a lot of difference, because in drug, in most of the cases there is a clear demarcation between phase 2 and phase 3. However, in drugs also many times that phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials are conducted. And assessment of safety, yes, that requires a comprehensive evaluation to ensure that the benefits of vaccines actually outweighs the risk. And here, as we have already mentioned, because the clinical trial is conducted in healthy volunteers, therefore the safety is of paramount importance, safety of specifically the trial subjects, because they are healthy volunteers. So in the focus should be that there should not be any harm, that minimize the risk, potential risk. However, because of complexity, that safety assessment actually depends on many factors, including the type of vaccine and its mechanism of action, and etc. and etc. And common reaction, as which are assessed in phase 1 clinical trial, those include injection site reaction, or swelling, tenderness, redness, and also fairly common for some other types of vaccines. And assessment of vaccine efficacy, that specifically two types of strategies are used for assessment of vaccine. One is that I have already mentioned, that phase 2 proof of concept. There also the some sort of efficacy is assessed, and then it is continued to the phase 3, where actually, which is a large clinical trial for confirming the efficacy. So far as COVID vaccine is concerned, I think because of, as we know, all over the world, there is an unmet need for COVID vaccine urgently, and therefore actually adaptive and seamless approach of clinical trials are adopted, and which allows for selection between the vaccine candidates and dosing regimens, and for more rapid progression through the usual phases of clinical development. Because in adapting approach means you may have some predefined criteria, that okay, we will have, after this many number of subjects, we will do this analysis or that analysis, and if it is found to be positive or negative, then further action can be taken so far as continuation of trial. So those are adaptive trial. And seamless trial, yes, where in one protocol you can conduct phase 2/phase 3. There will be two parts, then phase 2 one part, proof of concept, and then phase 3. So in the single protocol you can actually continue the trial from proof of concept to the phase 3 clinical trials. And in COVID situation, obviously all over the world, in many cases, that adaptive and seamless approach for clinical development of COVID vaccines are being adopted. And another challenge for COVID vaccine is that for COVID's efficacy assessment at present, that ICP, which is called that immune correlate.
Somewhere your volume, Mr. Pradhan.
Yeah.
Okay, it's better.
I'm audible.
Yeah, you are audible. And we have another 3-4 minutes. Is it okay?
Yeah. Sure. I have just come to conclude. So that another challenge for COVID vaccine is that ICP, which is known as immune correlator for protection. Actually, that means the correlation between the immunogenicity and actual efficacy. That is the efficacy to protect the infection. That correlation is right now is evolving. It is not there, unlike other vaccines, for which there that surrogate endpoints, that means immunogenicity correlation with the efficacy, are already there. So these are the issues. And also post-marketing clinical evaluation in case of COVID vaccines. Yes, once it is approved, that post-marketing safety and effectiveness of the marketed vaccine will include phase 4 clinical trial. It may include post-marketing surveillance to assess the AEFI, that is adverse event following immunization, and also adverse event of special interest. So those can be assessed. So these are the basic broad principle that I have mentioned. Now I think I have come to end on my talk. Yeah. We can
Thank
now
you.
discuss. If any question is there, yeah, we can discuss.
There are a lot of questions, and they are also on the Q&A in case if you can access it. And we can also send you, because there are many, you can respond later. But since we can take another 10 more minutes, if you can respond to some of the questions. Like there are a couple of questions. One is about the past track record of Indian agencies acknowledging the vaccine adverse effects, providing free treatment and compensation. That is one. And also, there is a question about, the Biocon Limited has two conflicting presentations on data results from the itolizumab clinical trials on COVID-19 patients. And then their latest presentation by company's own admittance violated the trial protocol. There is one. But coming back to the other the 4 vaccines, like there are many questions on that, and I would like to ask Veena and Amar if you have anything specific to Dr. Pradhan apart from these.
On the vaccine, I think there is a question about the Covaxin trial.
Yeah.
That was raised by Malini also.
Yeah.
We said that in the phase 1 there was a serious adverse event, and now this vaccine has gone into the phase 3, but nobody knows about this serious adverse event. And the second, I think, concern you can just note down was that when you give an emergency access, it should be based on Mayuri guidelines of the ICMR, and if that is so, that emergency access to the drug is based on the informed consent taken from the patient. So there is a question here which says that, do you have any mechanism to find out that all curative drugs that you have given emergency access, they are being monitored to find out that the informed consent of the patient is taken in a proper manner, and there is a regulatory mechanism to audit that informed consent. So these are the questions that I see here on the screen.
Yes. Thanks, Amar.
Yeah, because as you have rightly mentioned, because for emergency use, there is one of the condition is that prior treatment, that informed consent must be obtained. Yes, and if that is not being done properly, obviously it will be considered as a violation to the conditions of permissions. And yes, that needs to be monitored. And mechanism, because regulatory mechanism exists. If any violation is there, then obviously that regulatory action can be taken. But my point is that here actually all stakeholders are proactive as on today, even ethics committee, investigator and sponsors, and also all our civil societies. I think that is a very good actually approach, that all these effort will go into one thing, that yes, whatever is done, it will be done in the interest of the patient and population. So that is one sure, I think.
Mr. Pradhan, I have one small question. Like the way the sponsors are announcing, like it will be ready, and by mid-January or mid-March. Like how realistic, how that approval process can happen before the phase 3 has not been completed yet? Can they go and announce that? It's like assuring people and then making sure like it is going to be there. So. Uh, the approval processes definitely will be depending on the safety and efficacy data, right? So,
Yes, yes,
what
ma'am, you are absolutely correct. Actually, nobody can actually predict that okay, the vaccine will come. They may say that okay, we are doing these things. If it is completed, if this much data is generated, if it is found satisfactory in terms of risk benefit assessment, and then only it will be available. But instead of that, if somebody say that to the public that okay, we will bring the vaccine by first quarter, second quarter, this and that, because nobody knows what is going to be the outcome from the phase 3 clinical trial, and everything will be dependent on that, whether the ultimately vaccine is safe. And because as we have repeatedly actually emphasized that vaccine must be safe. First thing, it has to be safe because it will be given in healthy volunteers, unlike patient. Yes, if it is a terminally ill patient, because he may have his own comorbidity and many issues, but in case of healthy volunteers, nobody can afford that there is side effect of vaccines, serious side effect. So that has to be ensured. Yes.
So what about the waivers? Like there is a lot of talk about the waivers because it is, you need an emergency approval. So the approval part, if you can throw some light.
Because approval procedure is same as you are fully aware that actually we approve and we evaluate the clinical data or phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, every stage, even protocol amendments and everything in consultation with our experts. And that experts are experts from microbiology, from medicine, from immunology and pharmacology and all. It is a mixed kind of disciplines. So every point, any amendments even, we refer it to experts, and then it is deliberated and decision is taken. And therefore, and emergency use, yes, again, emergency use, we don't know what will happen when there will be a some sort of data that this data is sufficient for emergency use. Maybe if such proposal is received, again it will be deliberated in detail with the experts, and they will review the safety efficacy assessment. If it is found, because emergency doesn't mean that you can actually compromise in terms of some sort of efficacy or something safety. But yes, if you see the guidelines of US FDA, they have a guidelines on emergency use authorization. They have a rules and also guidelines on emergency authorization, that how they decide and what are the things they actually look into it while they approve particular drug for emergency use authorization. They particularly may, that if they are convinced that the drug may exactly, they have that if it is observed that the drug may have efficacy, then they can consider subject to other situational things and unmet medical need and life-threatening serious disease, unmet need, and all these things. So if efficacy, they may not have confirmed efficacy, but that guideline say that if it is found that it may have efficacy, then they may consider. Finally, they actually review and approve. So unlike full approval, in full approval, obviously they have to be satisfied that they have considered everything and they are of the opinion that yes, here the product is safe and effective. Otherwise, they don't actually need that the product has to be advantageous over another one, or it has to be some sort of advantage in terms of safety or efficacy. If they find that this product is safe and effective for this kind of indication and this kind of population, they if they are satisfied, then they can consider for granting full-fledged approval. Obviously, a lot of conditions they put. So this is how US FDA is. But in our case, in our COVID vaccine guidelines that we have uploaded, we have not mentioned specifically anything about how we will handle the situation where there is an application for emergency use, because these things, still we have to understand the situation, and we have to come up with a stage where that will be done on case by case. You see, as and when such application will be received, obviously it will be deliberated in details, and it will be decided accordingly, obviously in the interest of public.
Yeah, there are almost 40 questions for you. I do not know how much time you have. Like couple of things about the transparency, because that has come up, even in the presentations, like about, does the CDSCO have plan of regulatory oversight after the vaccines are rolled out? What about the transparency of the trial data on the public domain? And will they be, because ICMR and the government agencies are sponsoring some of these trials, so how can the regulatory body stay independent while evaluating these trial results and also placing the results of the clinical trial data on the public domain? And talking about the adverse events which happen, even if it is one or two, like how that can be looked into. These are some of the questions I can sum up. Like, yeah, we're almost 5:40, but if we can quickly answer to these, and then I'll give
Yeah,
it.
I think all these answer is that because for every aspect, we have regulatory provisions
Okay.
to address the serious adverse event issues and compensation management and all these things, and also for other issues also. And yes, we are trying and to improve the transparency and accountability every day. If compare the situation 10 years back or 20 years back, I think we have worked a lot of things with you people only, and we have come up to a stage where we can say we have actually improved a lot. But yes, we don't say that this is all. We have to continuously improve our system. That is how. And putting clinical data in the public domain, and yes, that is an issue. It has been raised many times. We have deliberated also, because US FDA or other regulatory authority like EMA, they actually prepare a summary basis of approval for any approval, and they put it in the website after proper adaptation. So that kind of system, yes, we have already deliberated on such type of systems, but everything will come maybe, but we are deliberating, and as and when it will be appropriate, and we will be able to do this, because there are a lot of issue also. Because if we are not able to adapt properly, the company can actually sue us, that how you have actually put this my trade secret in the public domain. So there are a lot of issues that things has to be deliberated and properly designed system. If it is in place, then I think it will be good for everybody. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. But we hope you will be available, because this is not the end. We will have many more consultations and discussions. We really would like to listen from CDC, which plays an important role in the the COVID vaccine candidates. So, and yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Pradhan, Deputy Drug Controller of India, Central Drug Standard Control Organization, and also to DCGI, Dr. Somani.
Thank you, Anant, Malini.
Thank you
All
everyone.
the participants here, and sorry,
And
question not be answered, but definitely, we must make sure these will be raised again and again, and there will be some answers we will get. Thanks, Malini. Anand, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone.
Thank you everyone for joining in and participating and asking questions, etc. For these, we will be holding our next webinar post Diwali. That will be the fourth in the series of 5. It will be on Tuesday, 17th November at 3:30 to 5:30. Please join in. I think the link has been placed in the chat. The next webinar is relating to a very, very interesting topic on COVID vaccine, on COVID-19 vaccines, on ownership and access, which is really a topic that is generally generates a lot of discussion and debate. We have 3 fantastic speakers. Our first speaker will be talking on the public goods, and the notion of vaccines as a public good in the framework of universal healthcare. Mr. Sundaraman will be speaking to us about it. Then we'll be looking at the international agencies and the development and distribution of COVID vaccines. And as you all know, Gavi and BMGF, etc. They are all involved in this, and we have Rohit Malpani who will be talking to us about some of those issues. And the third would be very interesting on intellectual property, vaccines, prices, costs, buyouts, etc. We have Kajal Bharadwaj who would be talking to us about it. So I hope you'll all have a very good, safe Diwali. Season's greetings to all of you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and please join us on the 17th at 3:30. That's next Tuesday.